It's such a pleasure to be here with everyone. And so I'm just excited to be learning over the course of these 2 days in the conference. But I'd like to start with an opening question. And Maher has really set us up beautifully for that, of thinking about the strengths of our immigrant origin students, thinking about just the extraordinary strengths young people bring with them, our immigrant origin students bring with them. Both those we might traditionally think that are academic, and those that we might not consider necessarily in the traditional sense academic, but have a huge impact on students' success both in and out of the classroom. And I would love if you would be willing to just give us a moment and share some of those strengths that jump to mind. So I am seeing folks share tenacity, resilience, hard work, intrinsically motivated, courage, absolutely, curiosity, resourcefulness, determination, and drive, enthusiasm, lots of resilience, lots of determination, humor. I love that, absolutely. Hard work, openness to adapt, faith, vulnerability, capacity to love. This is really, really beautiful. Thank you all for participating. It's really lovely, particularly when we're not all in person, to still feel that we are connected through the chat in small ways. I wanted to set us here because I think it's really important to ground and start the work of thinking about belonging, thinking about how schools can nurture a strong sense of belonging for immigrant origin students through thinking about the strengths of our students. I think too often, schools historically have been set up to focus on the deficits of students, what students lack, what students might need to work on or focus on in academics or maybe in English language acquisition. But that means that it can be too often the case where those many, many strengths, all those strengths that you've added into the chat and so many more are forgotten about, neglected, not invested in. And what a loss that is, both for students and for the communities that they are creating new homes and new lives in. So wanting to center all those strengths as we go forward into today. So I wanted to just start with telling you a little bit about me. My hope is in the next 35 minutes to give you tidbits, like little snapshots of some of the work that I have been doing and some of the extraordinary work that I've seen educators do across the country, as well as diving into what we can learn from our young people and learn from key laws, cases, and movements over the last 150 years. So I know that's a lot, but that's also why I give you the resource guide of there's just a lot more. I hope you'll check it out later. As was said in my introduction, I am first and foremost a teacher. I teach and have the joy and honor of teaching recent immigrant and refugee students from about 30 different countries in Lowell, Massachusetts, at the first integrated high school in the country. And my students are absolutely extraordinary. They come from so many countries and communities and backgrounds, from Colombia to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Cambodia. And it is from the extraordinary things they do both in the classroom and out of the classroom that ultimately inspired me to go actually step out of the classroom for a year and begin to research and write what became my new book, which I published in this past year, Making Americans: Stories of Historic Struggles, New Ideas and Inspiration in Immigrant Education. And I'd love to tell you a few of the stories that I have been immersed in the last 3.5 years as I've been writing and researching and editing this book, but really, again, grounding it in the strengths of my students. And it came from this place of seeing the extraordinary things my students did both in and out of the classroom. So seeing the ways that they teach and support each other, that they nurture their own learning, the courage. A lot of you mentioned that in the chat, the courage and strength and resilience they have as they are learning a new language, a new culture, a new home. They're creating new connections and community. And so all the ways that they are just showing those strengths, having that courage in the classroom, and then also all the ways they're bringing their learning out into the community. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. There's also more about the just really remarkable things my students do in the resource guide. But it was from seeing these many strengths of my students, seeing the ways they're impacting the community, see the ways they're creating new homes and new lives here, that really inspired me to want to go write this book. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about these stories, and then we're going to dive into listening to some young people, and hopefully too also creating opportunities for us to all learn from everyone on the call. We have about more than 200 people on the conversation today, and so I'm really excited to learn from everyone. I will share more about this particular project, but again, sort of thinking about the ways in which my students are being teachers and leaders in our community, and how we as educators, as schools, can be tapping those strengths, that wisdom our students bring with us. So I wanted to talk about a little bit about my book to sort of set up the structure of it, and set up the structure of how I thought about the types of stories that I think are really important as we're thinking about schools that nurture a strong sense of belonging. As I set out to write and to research, I realized pretty quickly that there were 3 sets of stories that I thought were important for us to learn from. First, stories of the past. I think it's really important for us in reimagining immigrant education for the future is we need to be looking at last 150 years of key laws, Supreme Court cases, and movements that have transformed immigrant education, many of which are not often known about. They're not often taught in schools. Many folks don't know about them. Hence, I'll be the first to say that almost all of the historical stories that I have explored over the last 3 years, I did not know. I'm embarrassed to say I did not know before setting out to research and learn them. But they're essential to know. They're important for us to be teaching in our classrooms, and they're important for us as educators to be knowing and thinking about the ways in which those impact our work today. And so first were those stories of the past. Second, I think it's essential for us to learn from stories of the present. There is really exciting experiments happening all across the country today. And I'll share with you a few of them. I have seen really inspiring work from work happening in one teacher's classroom in a single classroom in North Dakota to an entire school district in North Carolina. But what I also found really powerful and interesting is that many of these experiments, many of these ideas are not known outside their community. And that's a challenge. And that's something that I think we together can be working on. I'll give you the example of one, there's an extraordinary school that is 15 minutes away from where I work. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a little bit, but I didn't know about it until I set out to do this research. And that's a problem, because if I could have been learning from them for years before, and that could be impacting the work I do in my classroom. And so thinking about the ways that we can be better identifying really interesting experiments at the classroom, all the way up to the district level or outside in the community level, and thinking about ways that we can be learning from each other, both the learning from each other in our own communities, but also learning from each other across state lines as well. So I am inspired by what's happening in the present, and I also am intrigued by how we can create better connections so we can learn from each other. So we've got these stories of the past, we've got these stories of the present. Finally, I think it's really essential, and the conference so beautifully opens with, Maher, you're sharing your story of stories of the personal. And that, for me as a teacher, is really, really essential, of the importance of learning from our young people, learning from our immigrant origin students, and from them understanding how they experience our schools, a little understanding their journeys here. But really, if we're thinking seriously about reimagining immigrant education to best support our students, we need to go to our students and ask them how they experience school here. And so I've been exploring these stories of the past, present, and personal for the last 3.5 years. And they all come back to ideas around belonging. What does it mean to belong? And the importance of belonging, particularly for immigrant origin students who are creating new homes and new lives here. But what does belonging mean? So I present here, which you've seen, what I'm calling the 8 pillars of belonging. And these pillars I have learned from all those folks I talked to, from those stories of the past, folks at the heart of history, those stories of the present, educators across the country today, and those stories of the personal, my own students who I sat down with, and these young people generously and courageously shared their stories with me so that I could share them with you. And I present you these 8 pillars that all of these folks taught me, and I hope they resonate. That if we're thinking about how schools can nurture a strong sense of belonging for immigrant origin students, I think it's helpful to look at these 8 points. First, how are schools providing opportunities for new beginnings and also supportive communities? How are they giving assurances of security and chances to dream? How are we making sure we are committed advocates and nurturing those committed advocates? And then, as we said about at the beginning of the conversation, recognizing students' strengths and assets. Ensuring that we are accepting students for who they are, where they come from, and all their many beautiful identities. And finally, creating opportunities for students to develop their voice and for us to be valuing those voices. So, as I said, I hope these 8 pillars of belonging resonate with you. They are ones that I have drawn out from the teachings and learnings and wisdoms of so many folks I talk to, and really thinking about exploring these 8 pillars through these stories, the past, the present, and the personal. So my hope for the next 30-ish minutes, we are short and tight today. Again, resource guide has lots more in it, so this is just a teaser, is I'd like to share 3 stories of the past. I'd like to share 1 story of the personal and 4 stories of the present. And we'll go through them very quickly, but I hope they get you excited. I will just be upfront. I'm a history teacher, so I nerd out about the history, and I'm a writer, so I get like very nerdy and excited about these stories. So I'm going to try to rein that in and not talk too long about them. But let's start off with some stories of the past. So I wanted to share with you 3 very quick stories. These are built out much more in the book. You can explore them. And then I know we are later today going to be learning more about some of these historical and policy stories, but they are truly remarkable stories. And 2, what I find really powerful is that at the heart of each of these stories are the courageous stories of individuals, that inside each of these laws and cases and movements are people. And so it's really, for me, these are stories of people. The first, very briefly, is the story of Robert Meyer, who was a one-room school teacher in rural Nebraska, parochial teacher, who on a May afternoon in 1920 was teaching his class the Bible in German during recess. And for doing this, he was arrested, because at the time in Nebraska, it was illegal to teach languages other than English. Indeed, in half the states, about half the states in the country, it was illegal to teach languages other than English. In some places, to speak languages other than English. But Robert Meyer didn't back down. And so he took his case up through the Supreme Court, up through the courts, up all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1923, the Supreme Court came back in favor of Robert Meyer, enshrining for the first time the right for children to learn languages other than English. A number of years later, 1943, the Mendez family has recently returned to Westminster, California, and they go to enroll their kids in school. But they're told that while their cousins can go to school, indeed, actually, the school is their dad's alma mater, they are not allowed to. They have to go a mile away to the segregated Mexican school. Because at the time in California and much of the Southwest, there were segregated white and Mexican schools. But the Mendezes don't back down, and they start to organize with other families. They've recently leased a very prodigious asparagus farm in Westminster, and they take the money from that farm and they hire a civil rights lawyer, and they sue the school districts, and this case goes up to the Ninth Circuit in 1946. And in 1946, a whole bunch of organizations across the country are looking and following this case, including the NAACP, which writes an amicus brief written specifically by Thurgood Marshall, because they are watching this case as a possible stepping stone. 1947, Ninth Circuit comes back in favor of the Mendezes. The kids are in school. 2 months later, after the Ninth Circuit case comes down, 2 months later, the governor of California desegregates schools across California. 6 years later, the governor of California steps down and assumes a new position. What is it? Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's Earl Warren. And he, on the court, one of the very first decision he hears is, of course, Brown v. Board of Education, argued by Thurgood Marshall, who has in his case notes the notes from the Mendez trial. And then just one of those other additional stories that are really powerful from this is the story of that asparagus farm. Why are they leasing that asparagus farm? They're leasing it from the Munemetsu family, who have recently been incarcerated during the Japanese internment camps of World War II. And for a time after 1945 and the end of the war, the Munemetsus and the Mendezes lived together on this farm. There's so many other stories, again, of individuals in this one story, but just, again, the courage of individuals at the heart of these stories that have had a transformative impact on our schools and our communities today. And then finally, I'll just very, very briefly tell you one more is the coalition of advocates in Massachusetts, from those in the legislature and those outside in organizations, as well as educators, whose advocacy in the late 1960s led to the first bilingual education law, which then spurred similar bilingual education laws across the country in the early 1970s, and a celebration of bilingual and biculturalism, which then led actually to a backlash, because progress is so rarely linear, but led to a backlash and a spate of English-only laws, and then a real attack on bilingual education in California, Arizona, and then Massachusetts as well. But then finally, in the last 5-6 years, a new set of laws, particularly in Massachusetts and in California, that are celebrating multilingualism, celebrating multiculturalism. And so seeing that sweep of history, and also all of the different advocates, all those different coalitions that are working on the behalf of and working with immigrant origin children and families. I'm going to stop there with history, but I told you up front, I love history and I'm a history nerd. They are really cool stories. I hope you'll read more about them. I think they're important. But I wanted to center one story of a young person. And so very, very briefly, one of the projects that my students and I have done is a project that we've called We Are America. And it started out as a project in our class where my students each chose a story of self, and they wrote about it, and we together published a book. And then at the end of that first year, the students gathered in the classroom and said, this project, this work needs to continue. And so what we did is we actually launched a national project together. And it's one of the most inspiring things I've done in the last 4 years, is working with my former students, now as colleagues, collaborating and working with teachers across the country. Our website now holds more than 500 stories of young people from across the country, both in written form and audio. And then each teacher gets 100 copies of their book that they share in their community, and of course share with their now recently published student authors. And so what I wanted to do, and I'm going to put us out of share mode to just get us into audio. So I wanted to share one story of a young person to center their voice in here, because I think it's really essential we're listening to those stories of the personal. So I'm going to have us listen to, and I thought actually this is appropriate, and just a really beautiful connection with Mahara, you're sharing part of your story, a story of one of my students from the original We Are America book. So this is the story of Arij, who shares part of her story. The resource link to We Are America is in the resource guide, so you can go check out all those stories. But what I'm going to do is play her story. I'll go back to the page, so if it's easier for you to read, you can read that story. But I wanted to center her voice and her story and her wisdom here. So I'll play that now. This is a story she wrote when she was a senior in high school.
An Iraqi heart in America. My parents were so worried sending us to school every day because of the war. I was born in Baghdad in Iraq. Baghdad is a beautiful city with a lot of history, but also a lot of conflicts. I was 2 years old when America started a war in my country. I was 5 when the Civil War started. Every day on our way to school, we were worried about getting kidnapped or killed. I used to hear about so many people who got kidnapped and killed. I was depressed. I cried easily and I was scared. I did not want to leave my house or go to school. When I was at school, I used to hear gunshots every day during class. Even outside of school, sitting outside of my house, I would hear them. Every day, we would walk past guards in front of our school who would hold guns to protect us. When I would be sitting in my room, I expected any minute an explosion could happen, and indeed, it did happen once when I was 7. I remember I was in my room and suddenly an explosion happened nearby. All the window glass shattered. It was terrible to live under these war conditions. Iraq was safer in the 1970s and before. Iraq once had a really great civilization. Iraq was the first country that invented writing. We have had famous mathematicians like Ibn al-Haytham and al-Kindi, who is a philosopher. When I was little, I used to love visiting the Baghdadi Museum to learn about our history. There were wax statues that dressed up like how Iraqi used to live, and rooms that looked like how people lived in the old days. I loved learning about Iraqi history. But when I was 13, my family had the opportunity to move to the United States. It was unsafe in my country. When I arrived here, I was surprised by everything: the language, the people, and the culture. Everything was different. Schools in the United States are very different than in Iraq. They are much larger with many classrooms. Some things were the same. I saw security guards at my school, but without guns. But like Iraq, in my school, there were police officers with guns that were there to protect us. And here too, schools get attacked. What surprised me the most was the view of some Americans about Iraq. I learned that some people thought that my country is only a place that is destroyed and that there was no beauty. I wish people could see the many beautiful cities to explore the history and the museums and to learn about the many diverse people that live there. I wish it was safe enough for people to travel there. It hurts me to see what is happening now in Iraq. Even as I have made a new home here, I still miss everything in Iraq. I miss the rest of my family and friends. I miss the food and the spring weather. I miss the museums. All my memories and emotions are there. I cannot forget the fun that I had there. I still remember how we celebrated our holidays together every year with our family. I am glad that my family and I made it to the United States. Now my brother and I can get good education. My family and I can have a safer life now and have the best education in the world. I like too that I live with many people from around the world. It makes me so glad to see all of these cultures and learn about them. Even though I miss Iraq, I am also happy in my new life here. I have many friends from many places, many races, many religions, and many cultures. I believe being together from different places, learning from each other, makes us stronger.
Wonderful. So just wanting to center her story. And as you reflect on what you've just learned from her, I hope you'll think about these questions and maybe share out into the chat. What connections do you see between her story and maybe the work you do? What ways does her story extend your thinking or challenge your thinking in new directions? What strengths do you see coming through with her story? What wonderings or questions do you have? You, of course, don't need to answer all or any of them if you so choose. But I wanted to just make sure that we were centering a young person's voice because I think it's really important, those stories of the personal, learning from our young people if we're thinking about reimagining immigrant education. I know we are running sort of close to our time, and I want to share with you a few stories of the present. So what I'm going to do is I'm just copying these questions into the chat and throwing them in just so that you have them if you'd like to go back to them, just as I bring us back into slideshow mode. But I hope you'll, as we're talking, sort of share out some of your reflections. And I see folks already in the chat sharing some thoughts, some takeaways from all Reach has to share with us, all of her wisdoms. And I hope too that you will check out the more than 500 stories. There are both stories of young people who are recent immigrants and those who are, or they or their families have been in the country for many generations. The project is open to all students. And so hope you'll share and sort of reflect there. I so appreciate everyone who is sharing. And then I'll just give a shout out that if you are an educator and are interested in applying to the 5th cohort, we actually just opened up the application and we are taking potential applicants and we're considering applicants for the 5th cohort over the next month. And so I hope you'll apply. There is a link to the application in the resource guide. And we work with about 20 to 25 teachers across the year. And so this will be our 5th cohort. We'd love for you to apply, or if you know folks who should apply, or you have listservs that you want to send it to, we'd love for your help in sharing out about the fellows program. We're really excited to be working with another cohort of teachers so that we can be centering their students' stories in this project and work. But I've got about 10 more minutes left. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you. So I apologize and I hope that's okay. And again, I want to thank everyone who's sharing in the chat. I wanted to really end with stories of the present because I told you up front that there were just really all these exciting experiments across the country that I'm really inspired by, and I would love for us to be able to learn from. So I'll give you just a taste of 4 very briefly. And then I wanted to share a Padlet for us to be connecting with and learning from each other. The first is Guilford County, North Carolina. And this is an example from a district level that I'm really excited about. Myra Hayes is the EL director in Guilford County schools, and she and her team work to support teachers across 126 schools with about 7,000 EL students coming from about 30 plus countries. And they really wanted to actually take it back. For years, they had been working to support their immigrant origin students, thinking about different ways, different approaches, constantly experimenting. Some of them did okay. Some of them, sort of flashes in the plan, but they kept trying. And recently, in the last 5 years, they came across a way of reimagining literacy that really set high expectations for students. Then instead of, as in the case in many places in the country, where language is simplified, instruction is simplified for immigrant origin students, this was putting up front academically rich, juicy sentences, juicy texts, and then supporting students and then also teachers to be able to teach students to grapple with, pull apart, and put back together these sentences. And so really holding those high expectations for students, expecting and knowing that they can do hard, really challenging academic work with the right supports. So when I was at one high school in Guilford County, and I think it's really epitomized by these 2 sentences, I saw students new to the country grappling with the following sentence. On an autumn night in 1607, a furtive group of men, women, and children set off in a relay of small boats from the English village of Scrooby in pursuit of the immigrant's oldest dream, a fresh start in another country. A really academically rich sentence with just lots in there to unpack, lots of words. The grammar is really interesting. One of Myra's teams leaned over to me as I was reading this sentence and said, if you had come 3 years earlier to this school, to essentially this classroom, you would have seen students looking at the following sentence. Chimpanzees are eating bananas. Bananas are yellow. What a wildly different set of expectations for students and what they can achieve. And so how did they do it? And it's really fascinating. We won't go into it, but a few strategies and approaches that Myra's team has used to think about creating systemic change, systemic mindset shifts across an entire district. And I've just been really inspired by what they do. Another example at the school level is the Global Village Project in Decatur, Georgia, which is the only school in the United States dedicated to refugee girls who have spent a long time out of school. So today in the United States, if you are a 16-year-old, you've perhaps never had a chance at academic formal schooling, you come to the US, you are going to be placed typically in 10th or 11th grade. Good luck. That's not a winning strategy. And what the Global Village Project does recognizes that kids might need to start at the kindergarten level of education, but are also young women who have likely shouldered the responsibility and maturity of adults for many years. And you have to balance and honor both of those identities. And so the school has created a series of ways to think about how to support students meeting where they are, helping them grow, each sort of individualized, and supporting them by a whole series of local mentors. They've got 100 local mentors who come and work with students one-on-one every week to help provide students opportunities to practice, to learn, to capture, to recapture all that learning that they were either denied or had missed opportunities for earlier in their childhood. They also have created mentorships programs that help students and their families as they're navigating high school and college after they leave Global Village Project. So this is one example that inspires me at the school level. And again, I'm just going through them quickly because of time. At the classroom level, there is Leah Jolke's work in North Dakota, where she has created a class for essentially new Dakotans and old Dakotans, seeing the divide between students who are new to the country and those who have been in the country either for many years or whose families have been in the country for many generations, wanting to create opportunities to ensure that students are building bridges with each other, building connections with each other, building empathy with each other. And so just so many different ways in which she has done that in her classroom. I'm just sharing a few examples here, from crafting lessons to sharing stories, and just really centering the strengths of her students together. And then finally, at the community level in Lossie, right here in Massachusetts, for me, this is the one that's 15 minutes from my own school, that's centering family engagement and really seeing families as equal partners in the work of educating children, both in school and out, and really seeing families as strengths in the community and honoring families' knowledge and assets. So the school year always starts in the home, not with rules and regulations, but with questions from teachers to families of what are your hopes and dreams for your kid? What can we learn from you? How can we learn from you to better support your young person? And seeing those connections and seeing the ways in which schools can be supporting families, which also, of course, is supporting young people. So we've got 3 minutes. These are just a whole set of stories. I'm going to pull us out for 1 second to share with you 2 things that I hope that you'll add to later. And I know we've got just a wonderful day of learning ahead of us. I wanted to share with you this Padlet. So I'm just going to throw this into the chat right here. Here is the Padlet. And this is a place that I'm hoping that you will share approaches, policies, practices, programs that you are seeing, maybe using, that you are excited by, that you think are helping to nurture that sense of belonging, organized around the 8 pillars of belonging. And I would encourage you to share like a link to a website, or if you want to share a way to contact you, so that if another person is on this Padlet and goes, oh my gosh, that's such a cool idea, I'd like to learn more, that they can connect with you. I think what is really powerful that I have found is the hunger of educators across the country to learn from each other, and then the ways in which all of our learning is enhanced by those possibilities to learn from each other. And so I hope that you will collaborate here, share some of that practice from each other, check back in on this Padlet later after folks have had an opportunity to learn. And then I will just share, because I'm an educator, just a reflection here in the chat. You, of course, by no means have to do it, but again, this is a way for me to gather some of your knowledge. So hopefully we can share it out. So that is all there. And you have the resource guide. We're at about a minute left. And so I just wanted to end with a thank you. Thank you to all of the presenters today. Thank you to everyone on the call for joining in. And thank you for the opportunity to share some of this work. It's been a real honor to learn these stories, to learn from my young people, to learn from educators across the country and folks who have transformed history. And I'm excited to continue to learn and to partner. So if folks want to reach out and collaborate and partner, I would be so, so excited to. I hope you'll stay in touch. I hope this is the beginning of a conversation. And just thank you to the whole team for inviting me on to be part of this year's conference.
Jessica, thank you so much. That was very, very informative, but also very personal. And we will be diving into some of these topics with other presenters shortly. Quick question from Eve. She wanted to know, there's this tendency to want to lose your home language sometimes. How can we support students' growth in both languages?
Phenomenal, and both and in many. So I think about one of my students, Robert, whose story is in the book, where it wouldn't be ESL, English as a second language, but ETL, English as a 10th language for him. Yeah. So I think there's so many different ways. I think there are ways in which we could be thinking about bilingual education in schools, but that might not be appropriate for all schools. So say in Lawrence, where Enlace is, most students come in speaking Spanish. So bilingual education could work great. In my own classroom, we have 15 different languages spoken in the classroom. That might be much more challenging to do. So I think there are ways that we can still be centering language in the ways in which we, in our assignments in the classroom, are connecting home language to English, and that just centers and shows that we value, as educators, we value their home languages. There are also ways like the seal of biliteracy, which every state in the country, except for one, which is in the process, has adopted. So does your school district yet implement the seal of biliteracy, which allows for students to get a seal on their high school diploma that says they are biliterate in as many languages as they can prove? I think that's really powerful and exciting and new. I think there's some really interesting opportunities for AI in helping to develop and maintain home language that we're just sort of on the cusp of. So I think that's exciting. But I think there are really powerful ways, both intentionally in schools and classes, but also just in the way we are speaking about and valuing and showing our students that those languages they bring with them are really essential to continue to maintain, to continue to nurture and develop. Fantastic question.
That's why we call them multilingual learners, not just ESOL learners. And I just want to say that Lindsay was asking in the chat what other conferences and professional learning opportunities you all attend every year. So if you can add in the chat box what you attend, what you look forward to participating in. Ariana and I will be at the AFT Teach Conference next week. We'll be there, hopefully at TESOL next year. Jessica, thank you so much for this incredible introduction into your work. And you've really set the stage for the rest of the conference. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.